Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for that introduction, Anna. Perfect summary of the kinds of things that I want to talk about today. In fact, the previous session where we had so many interesting contributions from people about the whole field of problems that we face in the teaching of mathematics everywhere in the world, but different in every place. I feel like I would like to spend the first 20 minutes or half an hour responding to some of the interesting things that were said, but of course that's not my job. As you heard, I'm really sorry that Norma is not well. I hope she recovers speedily and will be back to give her talk tomorrow. That has given me 22 hours less to prepare myself for today, so I hope you'll forgive me. I want to thank the program committee and the organizing committee for inviting me. It's a very great honor to be invited to give a plenary talk and to come from far away, particularly to come to a place where there is such a strong history in the development of mathematics and mathematical ideas, and also such a strong history in psychology. That makes my job very daunting as well, as an outsider, to come here to this country and talk with you about Lev Semyonovich Vygotsky. I will do my best, but of course what I will be focusing on will be work that has been done, that I have encountered anyway, in mathematics education research around the world. My knowledge of Russian is about 5 words, and so I cannot read or understand probably many publications that have not yet arrived in English, or certainly not arrived on my desk. But of course, even if I did, as Vygotsky teaches us, I will just be reading in translation. And that means that I miss so much of the nuance, so much of the meaning of his ideas and other people's ideas from their original language. So my title today is intended to indicate first of all, that we are discovering more about Vygotsky's ideas as time goes on. And so the first part of my title is Researching Vygotsky himself. And I'm going to also be talking about research that has been going on in the mathematics education internationally that draws on Vygotsky's ideas. And in particular, you will hear that I will be emphasizing how Vygotsky's ideas emerged at a time when, throughout the world in education, and in mathematics education too, we have been very dominated by the ideas of Piaget that are quite different. And so one needs to understand the emergence of Vygotsky's ideas in that kind of context. I will also be trying to mention some connections between Vygotsky's research in Vygotsky's ideas and other research in mathematics education that I think comes very closely together with it. In particular, I'm thinking about sociology and sociological research. So we in the non-Russian speaking world came very late to Vygotsky's work, and actually in the education field even later. We can see in the 1950s the work of Reuven Feuerstein, an Israeli psychologist who worked with children, in particular traumatized by the Holocaust, emerging from the Holocaust, sometimes from concentration camps themselves, but also other children immigrating and bringing with them learning difficulties of their own. And we see in his work that he drew on similar kinds of ideas to Vygotsky and acknowledged his drawing on Vygotsky. The work that Vygotsky and his colleagues did in what's called in English defectology, not a very good word in English, I have to say, but then that's, again, one of the problems of translating. That work influenced many people working with children with different kinds of learning, special learning needs, brain damaged children and adults, and so on. And we see the evidence of Vygotsky's influence there long before it came into education. And when it came into education, it was first of all the language people who picked up what Vygotsky had to say and its significance for teaching and learning in language. We were, therefore, in mathematics education, rather slow. Of course, we have to acknowledge that we are very fortunate to have had these great 20th century thinkers, both Piaget and Vygotsky. And we have learnt enormously from both of them. Now, we know that Vygotsky read Piaget's writings. Indeed, Vygotsky wrote a preface to a Russian edition that was published in 1932 of Piaget's studies. And he expressed appreciation of Piaget's work there and in many other places. Those of you who have read Mind and Society and Thought and Language, and perhaps some of Vygotsky's papers too, will know where he agreed and where also he disagreed with Piaget. Interestingly, it seems that Piaget didn't encounter Vygotsky's ideas until some decades after Vygotsky's death. Indeed, a colleague of some of you who have been in the mathematics education world for some time, Gérard Vergniaud, who studied with Piaget, I believe he did his PhD with Piaget, met Piaget some years later when Piaget had indeed encountered Vygotsky's work. And he said to Gérard, and Gérard told me about this, that he was sorry that he had not encountered the work of Vygotsky's writings, long before, because he now, at that moment, understood how little he had really valued, perhaps understood, the role of language in children's learning. For him, it was an organizing principle, but for Vygotsky, it is, of course, fundamental, and he was sorry that he hadn't understood that much earlier. It might have influenced his own work substantially. In 1996, there was a conference. It was the centenary of the birth of both Piaget and Vygotsky. And that conference was held in Geneva, close to Piaget's own laboratory, the center of his work. The conference was called Growing Minds, and it was a joint meeting of the Congress of Sociocultural Research and of the Jean Piaget Society. The two conferences were kind of largely held separately, but they came, I was lucky enough to be there, we all came together for one day in order to look at ideas that crossed the interests of the two research groups. And the speaker that day was Jerome Brunner, who, if we look to the 20th century and into the 21st century for a third great influence in the field of education through psychology in particular, then Brunner would, of course, be that person. So here he was talking to a huge audience made up of the Congress of Sociocultural Research, basing its work on Vygotsky and others, and the Jean Piaget Society. And it was a quite wonderful talk, and in my paper you'll see a reference to it. If you haven't come across the paper, I do recommend it. What he tried to do in that paper was to look at the cultural, scientific, and social setting in which Piaget and Vygotsky began their work, which was very much around the same time, the early 1920s. Both of them began their interventions in the field of education, actually in child development psychology, but that work was rapidly related to and taken up in education. So what I've got here are two slides that summarize what Brunner had to say after having traced the historical and cultural development of these two great thinkers. What he had to say about those people who felt that it must be possible to bring together the different ideas of Piaget and of Vygotsky. So I will leave you to read these. I'm not going to read it out. They're in both Russian over there and in English behind me. Just before we come to the second slide, let me just say that in our own field of mathematics education, in the early 1990s, we saw a number of people very central and very active and very brilliant researchers in mathematics education trying just to do the job that Brunner was referring to, finding a way of bringing these ideas together in some way in what they called a social constructivism. Constructivism is a concept at the heart of Piaget's thinking, and of course, Vygotsky brings much more than just social, but that's how it was interpreted. So this is what Brunner had to say. Okay. Now, I said before that we in the education field, and mathematics education in particular, came quite late to Vygotsky's ideas. Indeed, I did a very little bit of literature research for a paper I wrote some time ago now, to look for the earliest references to Vygotsky, just to have a little bit of background and context to looking at his influence, the influence of his writings in our field. And you'll see 1988, 1985, these are the earliest references to his work. I was lucky enough, my first visit to Moscow was in 1993, when I came to a specially invited conference that brought together some of the Russian researchers here in this country and abroad who were working with Vygotsky's ideas. So I was lucky enough to meet Davidov and many others at that time. But still, we have to say that he died more than 50 years before in mathematics education, our first acknowledgement to what he had to say, to his writings. A recognition of how young he was when his life ended, how little he was able himself to develop his ideas and carry out research. Indeed, as those of you who know his history will know that he was quite ill from right early in the 1920s with tuberculosis, and couldn't, in fact, carry out much of the research that he himself wanted to do, and had to rely in particular on Luria, but also others. But what's important for us is to be aware that he continued revising quite radically how he understood child development from a cultural historical perspective, even on his deathbed. This is from a book by Wolf Michael Roth that came out just recently. Some of you know about this, but I certainly didn't until I read his book. Even on his deathbed, when he could no longer write himself, his family were writing down the things that he wanted to say, the ideas that he was still developing, where he felt he'd gone wrong in his work, and wishing that he would live long enough to be able to overhaul and completely revise all his work, which of course, sadly, he didn't. So it's left to us, as Roth points out, it's left to us to try to do, all of us, to try to pick up on what Vygotsky would have wanted to do had he lived, and what he would have been able to do. And that's part of what I want to refer to here. As I said, sorry, where am I going? Wrong way. As I said in my very first words, what made the task of understanding and researching Vygotsky's ideas so difficult for us was that his work appeared in the context of a Piagetian worldview, if you like, that dominated not only mathematics education, but education, schooling in general. Indeed, that is still the case today. Certainly British schools, the British school structure, its age structure, matches Piaget's ideas. Indeed, there was an educational report in the 1950s in England that helped to restructure the whole of schooling, and it was very much inspired by Piaget. Okay. So what I want to try to do in this brief overview, and also, of course, I can only represent part of what is in the paper. Certainly, all the references you will find in the paper. I want to begin by elaborating on the originality of Vygotsky's thought in the Piagetian worldview that was so dominant and still is so dominant in education. I will spend a little time on that. I then want to review some of the research directions that have been taking place by mathematics education researchers working with Vygotsky's thought. And I end with looking at future directions for research, current and future directions in research, drawing in particular on imagining what those fragments of his writing at the very end of his life might mean for us, thinking about taking his work forward both methodologically and theoretically. I cannot include everything in the paper. I will not have time, but there are things there that you would be able to look at. I want to mention, first of all, the term scaffolding, which came into the field of education, not specifically mathematics education, but has become, at least in the UK and the US, and perhaps much, much more widely than that, has become quite influential in thinking about teaching, and that is the term scaffolding. There's a quote here from Wood, Brunner, and Ross, where they talk about what's meant by this term, the term scaffolding. Scaffolding is a metaphor in the sense that it's understood clearly in building. When you are building a house, when you're working on the roof of a house, whatever it is, you build a scaffold that is outside of the house, but enables you to reach the parts that you want to reach. And so scaffolding also has the same kind of idea that the teacher can structure a lesson in order to enable children to arrive at what it is that she wants the child to arrive at. Now, I was kindly sent a paper by Anna just very recently, the last few days, indeed a paper written in the last few days, published in the last few weeks. So I was not able to incorporate it in my paper, but I really do recommend that you read it, by Anna Schwarz and her colleague Bakker, which is all about the history of the concept of scaffolding. So in my ignorance, I shall say no more. So this Piagetian worldview, as I've tried to describe it, is actually a recontextualization of Piaget's work in child development, because he was not an educator. He didn't see himself as an educator. He saw himself as a researcher in child development, in psychology, and his work was carried out not in classrooms, but in laboratories. And he developed his framework of child development, what's often summarized as ages and stages, from his interaction with children working on different kinds of tasks in his laboratory. The term constructivism is a term I can't say that it was entirely Piaget's. Perhaps there is somebody who's written a paper like Anna's paper on scaffolding about constructivism, but it certainly is very much at the heart of Piaget's thought, and that is that each individual constructs their own knowledge. The teacher does not construct anything for children. The children have to do the work on their own through processes of assimilation and accommodation, reflective abstraction. These are the kinds of notions that Piaget developed, the concepts that Piaget developed for understanding the work that the child needs to do to construct the mathematical knowledge for themselves. In the mid to late 1980s, certainly some people in the field of mathematics education, but work has been published more widely in education, developed something that they called radical constructivism. a kind of radical version of Piaget's work, where they had to admit that conceptualizing the work of a teacher is extremely challenging when you take fully on board Piaget's ideas that children construct knowledge for themselves. A teacher teaching 30 children devises activities for children to do, engages with the children in those activities, but can never know what it is that's going on inside the heads of those 30 children, 40 children, however many there are in the class. Making it a very challenging job for teachers to do. The best that teachers can do is to make a model in their own minds of a child's construction of mathematical knowledge. Oh, thank you. And so there's a kind of what Les Steffi calls a second level at which conjectures are being made, a second level of construction. But we can never get at what it is that is in the child's mind. Now, whilst Vygotsky certainly insisted on the recognition of the centrality of the teacher, and teacher must be understood more broadly as to incorporate also parents, more knowledgeable others, and indeed the way that the work of the ideas of other people are concentrated in tools and in particular perhaps in textbooks. Nevertheless, the role of the teacher is quite different, because what we're looking at is the interaction of the child with mediators that are brought by parents, more knowledgeable others, and teachers. And this has to be the case because the child's consciousness forms as one with those interactions. So what things mean in a cultural historical setting actually constitute the child's mind. As Vygotsky put it, we know the general law. First a means of acting on others, then on oneself. In this sense, all cultural development has three stages: development in itself, for others, and for oneself. And I was particularly struck when I first encountered this, when Vygotsky is thinking about the very youngest and earliest stages of a baby's development, where the grasping, the kind of random gestures of a child are taken on board by the parents as actually meaning that the child is trying to do something, trying to reach out for something. And because of the parents' reaction, that's what the gestures become for the child. And it's a kind of very strong way of us beginning to understand the point that Vygotsky is making. And indeed, in my last few years, I've been making a study of the youngest children at the very youngest age. Here they are, my grandchildren. I'd like to say that I've been taking extensive notes and written many papers about this, but I'm too fascinated in playing with these two to have written anything down. But nevertheless, it becomes clear when you have that idea of Vygotsky's that what adults do is to bring children into the meanings, the actions, the understandings, the activities, and everything else about the world. It happens in such a very rich way. I did get my daughter's agreement to show you the picture of the children, so it's okay. I want to just mention a second key point that I think we must take on board in educational research and in mathematics education in particular. I want to acknowledge the extensive work of Jeffrey Sachs, who's here, of course, and in particular some work I came across recently of one of his students, of Noah Morris, investigating different conceptions of mathematics in different cultures. It's not a surprise to those of us thinking with the thoughts that Vygotsky has provided us with, to see that such concepts of shape and space, of number, of probability and likelihood, all these kinds of concepts that we take for granted are universal and are captured in our wonderful mathematics textbooks, are indeed not the case. They are certainly not universal. What is universal is to be found in the process of the formation of mind, which always takes place in a specific sociocultural and historical setting. The second point, I should say, that was the first point. The second point that I wanted to make was that we must also keep in mind that Vygotsky's theory is a Marxist theory, driven by dialectical processes. And indeed, this particular quotation from Marx's work, it's not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. It inspired Vygotsky. It needs to continue to inspire us methodologically and theoretically in our own work. In what ways, what are the mechanisms by which the social context, the sociocultural context, isn't an influence on children, but is everything about the way that we, ourselves as adults and children, develop? So moving on to the second part of my talk, which is some examples from current research inspired by Vygotsky. I've summarized these under 4 headings, but these don't do justice to the whole field by any means. And I'm even not going to be able to talk very much about all of these. I've mentioned here, first of all, activity theory, and I'll say a few words about that here. I'll talk about teaching and learning in the zone of proximal development, and I will go in some depth in one particular example from research I've done with a colleague, Luciana Meira, a Brazilian. I'm going to say a very little bit about what is called collaborative work in mathematics classrooms. This for a reason, a kind of different reason to the others, which is I think that this is a misunderstanding of Vygotsky's work, and nevertheless is quite universal. My experience suggests it's quite universal around the world, and is thought to be drawing on Vygotsky's work. So I'll say a word about that, and also a few words about something called commognition, which has been developed by Anna Sfoud, and as I say, I'll just say a few words about that. So moving to activity theory, many of you will know that that historically activity theory begins with, in some senses ends with, Vygotsky's mediational triangle, but it is also called first generation of activity theory. That the connection between subject and object is always mediated, always mediated. What things mean. Back in 1994, I edited a collection of papers. One of the chapters was by Rick Pinkston, who's an anthropologist who had studied Navajo Indian children's concepts of shape and space, and the way that he describes their sense of geometry and their sense of the world, and how shapes actually change, mountains change throughout the day and throughout the seasons. It's not that they look different, but they are different. It brought home to me just how powerful it is to think about the location, the context in which, the cultural and social context in which things have meaning. Activity theory is talked about then as going through a second generation. That's the work of Leontiev and his concepts of activity, action, and operation, and to Engerstrom's developed mediational triangles called third generation activity theory, or often called CHAT, cultural historical activity theory. Now, I'm just going to say one thing actually in relation to activity theory research. But I've given you a reference here for just one amongst the many of collections that there are of research that's tried to draw on activity theory in mathematics education. And there's just one of them, the full reference in the paper. The particular point I want to make is that as far as researchers today working on activity theory in mathematics education are concerned, this first generation to second generation to third generation is by no means a historical process of theories replacing others. It's not that once Leontiev's ideas came along, we no longer thought about Vygotsky's mediational triangle. Nor is it the case that now that we have Engerstrom's mediational triangles, a much more complex structure than Leontiev's, we don't work with any of those previous frameworks. Indeed, it should be noted that Engerstrom's work, his complex mediational triangles are really elaborations of things that both Vygotsky and Leontiev were saying in their own work, but he captures it in his particular dynamic frameworks. But as I say, it's not the case that each stage of theory development replaces others. I'll have a little bit more to say about that when I talk about sociology towards the end of my talk. But I had a student who completed just last year a PhD looking at undergraduate learning of mathematics, and his particular focus was on the tools that students choose to turn to outside of the mathematics lectures in their universities. And those tools are other students, they are electronic resources, they are video captures of the lecture and other kinds of things. And in order to interpret what's going on in those situations, he drew on Leontiev's activity theory. He found those levels of activity, action, and operation the richest ones for analyzing his data, after having done a very thorough methodological look through all of the possibilities that there were for his work. Okay, getting muddled in my paperwork here. So I'm going to move on straight away to zone of proximal development, and as I say, I'm going to be giving you one example here. As you'll know, the zone of proximal development is actually a metaphor for the whole process of learning, from the young baby through all adult life. Key elements of it are the idea that knowledge is first on the social plane and only then on the internal plane. I've kind of been referring to that already. The zone of proximal development captures how that process takes place, and it's the mechanism by which the child is pulled into the whole of culture and knowledge at that time, in that place, into their tomorrow. And it's a methodological challenge and also theoretical challenge that is nevertheless so very inspiring for those who work in the area of zone of proximal development. And I, in the paper, talk about three examples. The first is about the emergence of a ZPD, whereas we as researchers looked at particular videos, looked at a particular situation, and interpreted what was going on as the emergence of a zone of proximal development between teacher and child. The second study that I won't have time to talk about, but is in the paper, is about interaction between a supposedly more knowledgeable other, between two boys, one of whom was supposedly the more knowledgeable other. And it seems to me, in having studied that video, that a ZPD doesn't emerge, and we can learn just as much about communication and learning and development by when it doesn't happen as when it does. Indeed, I'll say a little bit more about Luciana Meira's study and mine in a minute, because we did also look at some further interactions between teachers in this particular school and children, where we noted zones of proximal development not emerging, not happening, and so learning too didn't happen. And in the paper there is also a third example of a kind of mutual, what we can understand as a mutual zone of proximal development. That's to say the teacher is also learning. And indeed there's some senses in which the first example I'll show you also does identify where the teacher also learns from the child in that zone of proximal development. Okay, so here we are then in a Brazilian nursery school. And this first picture, the child is walking towards the teacher, the nursery teacher, who initially has her back to the little boy. And the child comes along and calls to the teacher, Tia. Tia is a familiar name, it really means aunt. And the teacher turns back to look at the child. So the little boy is 2 years, 6 months, actually the oldest pupil in her class. So he's almost pre-verbal. He can speak a little, but many of the other children can't. These children in general are almost pre-verbal. He was initially leaning against the window on the left in the photo. I'll show you another photo shortly, so you'll be able to have another look. And was looking around. Now, we saw this from the camera angle. The teacher didn't, because she was busy preparing materials at the other end of the room. Pedro was the first child to arrive, so he was the only one there, except for researcher. I was not taking video or in the classroom, actually. I benefited from the data collection of my friend Luciano. I did study some Portuguese because I was intending to go into some classrooms with him, but my Portuguese was never good enough, not even for the 2 years, 6 months children. On the bookshelf by the back wall, as you will see in the next picture, there are 2 plastic trays which have got some experimental plant development going on. There are some beans that have been placed on cotton wool. The cotton wool is watered, and the shoots are beginning to come out of the beans. The teacher had in fact told the children that eventually the beans would be moved to outside the classroom, just outside the classroom, outside the window, in fact, where the little boy, Pedro, had been standing initially, to the earth where there's a little kind of garden for the classroom. So up to this time, now I will go back to that picture, the teacher didn't notice what had been going on with little Pedro. She didn't notice what he was looking at, what interested him at all. In fact, she was very busy with her own work, setting up the class ready for all the other children to come. So Pedro walks towards her and calls her. She breaks her previous flow of action, preparing materials, and begins a movement of standing up to face the child and replies, "Yeah," in a way that expressed her openness to the child's request for attention. So he's pointing behind him. Behind him there's the window. Outside the window is the garden. Behind him also are the shelves where the seeds, the beans are beginning to sprout. The teacher, together with Pedro, walk towards the bookshelf. It's growing up, isn't it, Pedro? Now, this is a critical passage. Actually, the teacher didn't specifically know what Pedro was pointing to. All she had was his pointing. And we studied this picture very carefully. And we're not convinced that the child was pointing at the plants at all. May well have been pointing to the window. So at that particular moment, the teacher took a leap, if you like, at guessing what it is we list in the paper. We've listed in the paper published, but also in the paper for this conference, we list some of the possibilities that the teacher could have assumed was going on, that Pedro might have been wanting from her. But she chooses to say, it's growing up, isn't it? She chooses to focus on the beans because she knows from previous work with the children the day before and previous days, they were really excited by watching these beans grow. Things were happening every day. And they were also excited by the idea that the plants, these beans, were eventually going to be put out into the garden. He certainly made a pointing gesture, but she made that leap as to what it is that he wanted to know about, what was catching his attention at that moment. Okay, so as I've said, she could only guess on the basis of undetermined clues what it was that Pedro wanted her to pay attention to. So, in her conversation with him, she talks about the beans, how they're growing, how delicate those little shoots are, how he must be careful. You know, children can very quickly destroy a plant with just a wave of their hands, how he must be careful, and so on. And the child is totally absorbed. Now, we use this term catching each other's attention because the two things had to go on at the same time, right? And in fact, they can't do. They're kind of consecutive. But the child has something that has caught his attention. And the teacher is trying to guess what it is that had caught his attention and tries to catch his attention at the same time with the things that she wants to talk about. And what she wants to talk about is straight away that the plant's growing, that things are happening, that he must be very careful with it, and indeed they're going to plant it up outside. So she's immediately bringing into the situation the scientific, if you like, the horticultural knowledge, pulling little Pedro into his tomorrow. And that's the teacher's role. Not simply to say, yes, it's nice, isn't it, and then move on. But her job is to bring the culture of today, at that time, at that place, to pull the child into their tomorrow. So there are 3 points I want to just mention in relation to this study. First of all, that the emergence of the ZPD is always in the moment. It doesn't pre-exist the interaction. There are some ideas that as children walk in the class, the teacher looks and can see some kind of bubble around the child that is their zone of proximal development. Of course, it's not like that at all. It's in the learning activity, and I remember Davidov saying this very clearly, and I learnt a lot from that. It's in the activity that the zone of proximal development can emerge, and it doesn't pre-exist in any sense, the activity in the classroom. Second is the love and care of the teacher. The teacher could have thought to herself, look, I'm busy, late night last night, I'm tired, I haven't had a chance to get everything ready for the children, I can't bother with little Pedro, his mother shouldn't have dropped him off so early anyway. Not at all. That's not what teachers are like. Teachers are there because they care for and love their children. And so immediately she turns around and is pulled away from what she was doing in order to see what had captured his attention, and therefore for her to capture his attention too. And the third is this point, that there is a unity of the child's development with cultural historic knowledge of scientific and horticultural communities. There's no separation of knowledge and consciousness, culture. They are a unity. And I'm going to come back to that a little later on in my talk, although time is passing. The next point, activity theory, zone of proximal development. The third point is this idea that I think is a common misunderstanding and important, therefore, to raise in an audience like this. And that is that there's a common understanding that Vygotsky's work means that children should talk to each other and that the teacher should not dominate the classroom. And indeed, this is the shift that Vygotsky brought about in educational understanding. Rather than having the teacher dominating from the front, that the teacher is some kind of guide on the side in children's learning. Well, in a very deep sense, that is indeed the case. But the misunderstanding is that what Vygotsky's work implies is that you seat children around tables in groups and you let them develop concepts and ideas in mathematics or anything else by themselves. But the point is that knowledge precedes everyone, that there is mathematical knowledge that is in the teacher's domain, or perhaps the textbook's domain, or perhaps the domain of some of the children in the classroom. And the idea of negotiation, that we can negotiate, the children can negotiate between them the meaning of mathematical terms, concepts, tasks, activities, whatever, is misleading. It comes from the social, it seems to me, it comes from the social constructivist idea that children have to construct their own knowledge for themselves, and that collaborating in groups, bringing somehow some notion of social into the mathematical thinking that's going on, is a kind of Vygotskyan idea. But that is indeed not the case. As the previous example has shown, I hope, it's essential that the teacher recognize that it's she or he who must pull the children into their tomorrow. And teacher in the widest sense, as I referred to before, more knowledgeable others, parents, teachers, textbooks, and things that are embedded in tools but need teachers to bring out that embeddedness, what it is that the tool is bringing. The final example I'm going to refer to here, as I say, these 4 areas, areas of research that are going on are by no means the totality of what's going on. But this one is becoming very influential. It's the work developed by Anna Svard in about 2005. A book came out in 2008. And you can look at research journals now and you will see many, many more papers each year referring to her work, and in particular this strange word, comognition. It was an attempt by her to bring together communication and cognition, and not to think of them as in any way separate. She, much earlier on, had written about some ideas of participation or some kind of apprenticeship and a participation rather than an acquisition metaphor. And it's a kind of huge step on from there and an elaboration of it. As Anna Svard recognized, it builds on a fundamental notion of Vygotsky's, where he wrote, thinking is speech, conversation with oneself, and it's from that all of her work really develops. I've got some of the concepts here in these slides. I won't go into them in detail, and indeed hardly at all. In the paper you'll find them elaborated. The terms that I just wanted to bring them, there are actually 2 slides, this one and the following one. I'll go back and let you read it if you wish to just now. The point that I want to make from this, and as I say, there's some very rich research that's going on, and I do encourage you to take a look at it. The point that I want to make from this is a slightly more general one, in that what Anna has developed in her work is a particular vocabulary, a grammar. And it's not uncommon. I've come across people who have said, look, there's too many terms in Anna's work. I can't work with comognition because these terms are too difficult to get your head around. Precisely because they are difficult to get your head around, they become rich and useful. And we, all of us, need to do the work to understand the language that is being used for research, precisely because a rich grammar brings many more possibilities for doing research. As I say, I will come back to this at the end when talking about sociology. So she has terms like word use, visual mediators, endorsed narratives, and routines. We need to understand what those terms are to see what it is that researchers are doing with them. Oh, right, so there were 3, I apologize, there were 3 slides there, but I won't dwell on them now. I want to talk just about something about future directions, current and future directions. First, I believe we still have lots of work to do in terms of looking at zones of proximal development. In particular, I don't know that we've ever really grappled with Marx's concept, it's actually Hegel before him, of the concept of the ascent from abstract to concrete. I know I certainly struggled with that for some time, perhaps only came to understand it when listening to Davidov and others who at that conference that I mentioned in 1989. So much more work, I think, that we need to do to understand working in the zone of proximal development. But also other developments like comognition and so on. I won't say more about those. I want to say more about these 2 other points, though. The first is that of ethics. In the earlier slide, I mentioned, I quoted the work of Roth, or quoted from his book, where he indicates that in the notebooks that have appeared, and I haven't yet had a chance to look at them, but I hope to do so soon. In his notebooks, Vygotsky talked about that he was dissatisfied with his work in the sense that he never really took strongly enough on board the sense in which Spinoza informs his whole worldview of child development and, for us, of education. So Roth actually talks about Spinozist, Vygotskian, monism, using these terms all together in one. Spinoza, of course, worked in the 17th century, was alive in the 17th century. Levinas is also a significant influence in ethics. Levinas also draws on Spinoza. His work is much later, though he died in 1995 only. Nevertheless, Levinas's work is becoming of great interest to mathematics education researchers, and I can point to the work of Lewis Radford in particular, who has looked at Levinas's ideas. I've got a reference there. What Radford is actually talking about is that teaching is an ethical practice. You can see it so vividly in that example of the nursery teacher and the child before. How the teacher's love and concern and care for children meant that she turned aside and immediately interacted with the child. That's just an example, but all teaching is an ethical practice. Indeed, researching is too. I think a lesson for us as researchers is to stop and think when we plan a piece of research. Are we going to be interfering with the children's learning when we carry out this research? Are we going to be misrepresenting the teacher? Perhaps we want to show how the teaching that's going on isn't rich enough in some way. Can we protect teachers from any kind of criticism? Our research is used politically. It certainly is here, as we heard in the presentations before. It's used everywhere around the world. We need to think about that as researchers, as to what we're saying and how indeed it may be taken up by the politicians. So teaching is an ethical practice, and what Radford tries to do in his research is to look at how teachers encourage ethical kinds of practices between the children themselves in their learning. Vygotsky's interest in Spinoza was in his what's called monist ethics, that is, drawing a distinction between monism and dualism. So much of philosophy is dominated by the dualistic separation of mind and body. But Spinoza was very much ahead of his time in arguing for no separation between the individual and the mind and the body. Indeed, they are just one, as he says here. So Roth writes that actually one of the notes that was written down for Vygotsky for his own work was to bring Spinozism to life in Marxist psychology. So somehow that's a real challenge for us. Spinoza, Marxism, psychology, education, and in particular, mathematics. So it seems to me that it's not very hard to understand how Vygotsky's work was already Spinozan, and it's a great interest to think about where he might have gone to take it even further, because he himself was dissatisfied with the extent to which he'd drawn on board the monism of Spinoza. In fact, if every function of the child is first social and then psychological, and indeed consciousness develops in his particular context, historical and so on context, then, and how studies like those of Jeffrey Sachs and others have shown us how different concepts are in different places in the world, it's perhaps quite easy to see how Vygotsky is very much influenced by a monist tradition and not a dualist tradition. I like the distinction that Roth emphasized, pointing us to what Marx talked about. I am certainly, like everybody else, like so many others, I should say, guilty of using the term social, when in fact what we perhaps should be talking about is societal. And Marx himself drew this distinction. what is societal is what is universal. That is to say, what are universal concepts, perhaps, cultural or scientific ones, in any particular time and place that are brought by the teacher. The social, perhaps, slips us too easily into that kind of social constructivism of the negotiation of children together. What's essential is the societal, what is brought by the teacher, and tools, and so on. So I will end with just talking a little bit about some work that's influenced me in the last 15 years, I suppose, apart from looking at my grandchildren, that is. And that is in sociology. I've been particularly influenced by the work of sociologist Basil Bernstein, but there are others, Michael Appel, Pierre Bourdieu, and others, who take the same approach to Bernstein takes the same, he's a sociologist of education, takes the same approach to teaching learning as Vygotsky. What Bernstein does is to show how education reproduces different social advantage and reproduces social advantage and disadvantage. Schools reproduce the backgrounds that children come from. The middle class children succeed. We call them middle class and working class in the UK. You must turn that into your own context here in Russia or wherever else. But for us, middle class children succeed in schools and working class children don't. As sociology, of course, these are generalizations. And we all know of cases of children who buck the trend and don't develop in that way. But in general, schools continue to disadvantage already disadvantaged children. But that's not because there's anything wrong with the children. It is because of their lack of opportunity for learning. If you've come across the study that Vygotsky and Luria did in 1929, as I mentioned earlier, Vygotsky couldn't travel himself, but Luria carried out this work, looking at the basic forms of activity, the principle of basic forms of activity that appear when children go to school. It was a study of how different groups of people in a kolkhoz, a farming community, understood the collection of a piece of wood, a hammer, and a saw. In what sense they interpreted those in different sets, different roles, different kinds of tools. It's exactly the same ideas as Bernstein uses to show how it is that middle-class children arrive at school with those generalized scientific concepts already available to them. And we as teachers identify these children as already on the way of the direction of schooling. And so they become the focus of our attention, and not those children who haven't had the home opportunity to learn the kind of language that, the language which carries the concepts, the different forms of activity that education is all about. And indeed, it's a question of time and resources and so on, and that's all. And that's so important for us to understand. So there are some references in my paper to some research that shows how this sociological work is very much along the same kinds of lines as Vygotsky's thought. Sociological work drawing on Bernstein's sociology. And I think that the work that we've done, I've just referenced one paper here, I think there may be one or two other references, to ways of researching Vygotsky, researching with Vygotsky, and bringing sociological insights to enrich and extend our knowledge and our practice both as researchers and also as teachers. And it's there that I end with saying thank you once again for this invitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And we have quite some time for questions, which we will be glad to hear. And I'm sure Steve have covered quite a lot of material, and let me put it in a rather abstract way. So let me start from a questioning. while others are getting prepared. You talk about mutual zone of proximal development. I know it's work by Radford and Roth, and we used to think of zone of proximal development as very one-directed thing. It's like a teacher helps a student in a specific place. Could you kind of exemplify and explain why is it powerful to think about zone of proximal development as mutual and bidirectional?
Yes, okay. I think we say this a little. I think I say this a little more in my the paper for this conference, but certainly do much more in the Meira and Lerman paper that to do with this little child that we were looking at before. What we say there is that not only was the teacher helping little Pedro learn about science, in particular about horticulture, but Pedro was also learning about communication, about the pedagogic relationship, as Bernstein calls it, between the teacher and himself. What he learnt was, and we see this in further communications between Pedro and the teacher and some of the other children, what he learned from that was if he wants to tell the teacher something, he has to be more specific. At the very most basic level, we're talking about almost pre-verbal children. If he wants to ask the teacher something, pointing isn't sufficient. He's going to have to narrow it down. The conversation, in fact, between him and the teacher helps the teacher shift her responses to him just a little. Every time that Pedro utters something, he's refining his communication with the teacher, and the teacher is learning what it is that Pedro is coming to learn in trying to develop his communication skills. So she says something to him a little later about the beans that are growing, the shoots that are growing here, and he kind of repeats what he was saying before. He says, and this, and then he says, and this again afterwards, which leads the teacher to think, maybe I didn't quite catch what he's talking about. Let me try again. Let me try and see if this is what he was actually asking me. So she too is learning within that zone of proximal development about extracting from children or helping children learn how to communicate with a teacher, how to develop this pedagogical communication at the same time as Pedro is learning himself to refine the way that he indicates things to a teacher. So that's one example, perhaps.
Thank you. I think it puts us on the ground to feel what is meant. And I know there is a question by Angelica.
Thank you for this inspiring words. There has been a point where all over the world the politicians have thought about how to increase the time to work on a task. And this has led to strands or directions that go in a different direction than you stress. So there is a lot of individualization in the schools going on in different countries and different cities. And so it happens that children learn a long time alone with their tasks. And the teacher is around or not even there. And there is probably some out-of-field teacher there who cannot answer or cannot give a diagnostic answer. So taking this societal idea and the zone of proximal development together with these kind of things that appear in schools with ethical kind of conditions the politicians think they do for the children in the school. Can you comment on that?
I haven't encountered that particular example. We had a different kind of example in the UK where politicians looked at the international comparisons of children's performance in mathematics and other things, science and English and so on, and saw that Hong Kong, or Singapore rather, the children were performing almost at the highest level, almost with Finland, but not quite. And so the British politicians decided that obviously British schools should go over to the Singapore methods of teaching. So they actually brought some Singapore teachers to the UK, and they were supposed to teach British children. So ignore thousands of years of Chinese history, a country on the other side of the world. We can ignore all that. What they do needs to be transported to Britain. Just recently in the newspapers, I saw that the whole experiment has been perceived as a failure. And that would have been, if they'd have asked us, then they would have understood right from the start. And it seems like here is a similar kind of case. I mean, how they jump from drawing on sociocultural, Vygotskian, whatever you like to call it, theory, to the idea that children must spend more time working individually, puzzles me a little, to say the least, at this particular moment. But certainly, in these two examples, you see how it is that politicians work in the short term. They want to make sure they get elected next time. They're looking for quick fixes, we call them in English. Something that's going to transform things, and I can hold up my hand and say, I brought about this innovation in education, and see our children are doing better. I remember an occasion when something like that was going on in Britain the end of the 1990s, and a group of us, of professors in mathematics education, managed to get a meeting with a government minister. Actually, the government minister didn't appear, but somebody 3 or 4 layers down in the hierarchy agreed to meet with us. And we tried to explain how some of the innovations need some research to be done, and not just jump in and do this kind of work because it looks good. And we were told in no uncertain terms that we could go away and do whatever research we wanted, but that wasn't going to inform government policy. So it sounds like it's a similar kind of thing. I mean, certainly what we have to understand is that school mathematics textbooks, and I was involved in a couple of pieces of publications in recent years where we were looking at a young child of one of the writers, one of the researchers, looking at a young child's innovative use of a television handset. She came rushing in from having watched the television, and she said, "Look, Mummy, 3, 6, 9, that's counting in threes. So if you think of your television handset, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or most of them do anyway, 7, 8, 9. So the child could see the numbers being arranged, and indeed the mother, being a mathematics education researcher, quickly switched on her phone so she could record the conversation, got the child to repeat it, and then said what would come next. Well, there were 3 buttons underneath the 7, 8, 9. They weren't numbered. They were, I don't know, switch channels, mute, something else. But she was able to use them to say 10, 11, 12 would come next. So we've got that down too, and then the parents said, well, what's going to come next? And she couldn't actually take it any further. Point I want to make is that handsets, remote controls, are designed. They carry in them concepts of the designers. So all the tools that we use carry those concepts of the people in them. Mathematics textbooks do exactly the same thing. So there is a sense in which we, all of us, have had to learn in our mathematical education how to sit alone at home with a textbook and see, and try to see the people, the textbook writers at least. Well, actually, I don't know that we were ever taught that as children. But as researchers, we certainly do think about where is the textbook writer in this? Where are the political constraints in all of this? So there is a presence of other people somehow, but it's not a direct one. And certainly the idea of individualization, we went down that line in the 1980s. It was thought of as a good idea, individualized learning of mathematics. Work cards, children choosing work cards, and it was lovely stuff, wonderful tasks. But the teacher had to keep out the way and let the children do it themselves, and that was didn't work. Yeah.
Thank you. And I guess this is a lifelong theme, how mathematics education research is actually being implemented and how it can be influenced and vice versa. And let us move a bit further with the questions. And Alexander Podyakov is a professor of High School of Economics.
Thank you very much for your presentation. May we speak about about not only zone of proximal development, but also zone of inhibited development. For example, if a child can learn less mathematics after application of some methods of teaching, if a child understands less, it seems to me that we can speak about zone of inhibited development. His development or her development was inhibited, was repressed. The other question concerns Vygotskian concept of ideal form. Really, different teachers, mathematics teachers, can have very different concepts of ideal form. I have my own experience of studying mathematics in a usual secondary school, and in a scientific mathematical circle. And I understood that two teachers can have very different rules and meta rules. Here we can have a conflict between different ideal forms. What is your opinion concerning these issues?
Okay. Well, thank you for your question. I'll try to be brief because we don't have a lot of time, of course. So the first thing that I would want to say is, and I've written quite a bit about this myself in different places. We are up against a real challenge when teaching mathematics. There is a popular culture around in which, at least in the UK and many other parts of the world, I don't know if it's true here in Russia, that it is perfectly respectable, even a credit to you, if you are able to say in a public place, perhaps a party, oh, I was never any good at mathematics, hated the thing, went into a mathematics classroom and I would panic. It's fine to say that. Of course, you don't say that about reading. It's not fine to say that about reading. So that's just one example of how we are, as mathematics teachers, up against a culture which doesn't view the learning of mathematics as anything especially to be proud of, except that you could say that the same people would say of somebody who's good at mathematics, well, they must be brilliant. They've got a brilliant brain, whatever it is. So, we really do have enormous challenges. And so when you talk about zone of inhibited development, I spent 15 years as a school mathematics teacher before I did research and moved into, before I did my own PhD and moved into teacher training and into research. And so I'm well aware of the problems and challenges and difficulties of teaching mathematics, and how we as teachers of mathematics often make things difficult for ourselves, perhaps because of the ideal forms that we have that you're talking about, the ideal forms of a teacher. But anyway, this isn't the place to go into all of that. I just wanted to say that it is, very difficult globally, and certainly very difficult issue, the whole thing about the teaching of mathematics. It's not getting better over the years, in spite of growing research communities, growing numbers of journals, growing concepts, excellent quality work. We're not actually making much difference to children's enjoying of school mathematics. And we have to think about that, and we have to worry about that. All kinds of outside constraints, teachers' salaries, years of training, but it is also about the nature of mathematics and ourselves too. And your second point was? Oh, yes, thank you. there's, amongst politicians, there's often a lot of talk about the teacher that inspired them. I think in teacher education, what I've always found is that students come into the teacher training course with an ideal form in mind, usually an ideal teacher who inspired them to do mathematics or not to do mathematics or whatever. So I think that it's typical of us, if this captures your question properly, I don't know. It's typical of us to have an ideal form of a teacher. One of our jobs in teacher education is to encourage students to question that, to think about that, to challenge it, to think about who they are as people and how they relate to children, to bring to them theoretical ideas such as Piaget, but such as also as Vygotsky, to help them to reconceptualize how they can be in a classroom, and perhaps to try to replicate some ideal image that they've encapsulated in their minds from their own learning experiences, perhaps not the best way to go into a classroom. I don't know if that addresses properly your question.
Thank you. And we have one more very short question. Very short question. Are you managing to make a very short question?
Hi. I would like just to bring an example as a question about mathematics and the fear it brings to people. I have a friend from Iraq, I'm from Greece, and he hates mathematics. He never liked it, the subject matter. He had teachers who preferred to punish him than to teach him. And at the end, he had to have exams on mathematics. And he had some quick lessons with a guy. And then he had achieved 80 out of 100 in the exams. They didn't believe him, the students. They asked him to repeat the solutions. He still hates mathematics. Is he good in mathematics or not good? He can solve many problems he's perfect with tools and instruments. So I'm just posing this question to show that it's not an easy border and I would like your comment on that. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, there's been some very nice work recently done by Alexandre Paes from Portugal, by Paula Valero, I don't know, she moved recently, I think she's in Sweden, and by some people in Brazil too, which addresses directly your question. A qualification in mathematics can be thought of, and this is a kind of Marxist idea, both for its use value and its exchange value. Your student or your friend needed this for its exchange value. If you want to be in the UK a teacher of art at the high school, you have to have a good pass in mathematics. This is about the exchange value of the qualification. Its use value is a question of whether you can indeed use the ideas in other things than just writing examination questions. And I suppose it's in that area that we could answer your question, is a person good at mathematics or not? But for the vast majority of students, it's the exchange value that matters. They never want to look at mathematics again, but they need that pass because they need the piece of paper. Just a short answer to the question.
Thank you. We're finishing by this question.